Hi, everybody, and welcome to our Lenten study that we're just beginning today on this first Sunday of Lent. We're doing a book by Mary Jane Gorman that is called Watching the Disciples and Learning from Their Mistakes. And so as we look last time at the Gospel of John and all the work and the teachings and the leadership that Jesus did, today we get to flip sides and we get to begin to see things from the disciples' perspectives and how it was that they learned more about what Christ was and what his Christ teachings were and what they mean for us living as followers of Christ today. I'm using, this is the cover off the book that you see before you. It is called Peter and John Running to the Tomb, and it's by an artist named Eugene Bernard. And I love this picture. It always reminds me that we're to come into the season of Lent with a sense of expectation. And you certainly see that in the faces in this painting, the clasped hands of fervency, if you will, the look of anticipation, a little bit of fear, a little bit of the unknown. And perhaps that's how we all enter this season of Lent. And so we'll refer to this picture over and over again, but I just love the expressions that are captured here and think they are pretty much probably what the expressions were. You remember the part of this story was that Mary Magdalene had been to the tomb. She had seen the stone removed in the absence of Jesus, and she ran to tell Peter and the beloved disciple, and this is them racing then to the tomb to see what the story how it would unfold. So anyway, wanted you to start with seeing this today, place it in your mind and thoughts as we move into today's study. So today we're going to start, kind of with just a brief introduction as we talk about these disciples and how it was that they were being called to follow the teachings of Jesus. And I think sometimes we forget, maybe in our own lives and how we live, that this must have been easy for them. But we must remember that everything Jesus said at the time, and it's still true today, is often the polar opposite of what political leaders are teaching, of what cultural teachers are teaching us. And so in that way, even though times and cultures have changed, the expectations of cultures throughout the ages have often been the same. A thirst for power, a thirst for greed, a thirst for self. And, we still see those things being played out in our circles today. Well, it wasn't much different in Jesus' day. And he was actually giving a countercultural message for a group that was really living in a very power empire driven time. There'd been one empire after another and would continue to be as being predominant, and they would be the driving force. And so here Jesus was truly coming to flip the world upside down and to teach a different way of life. So when we look at these men, I think sometimes we forget their ordinariness because we have grown up seeing them listed as apostles. We've seen them in stained glass windows. We've heard of their works of going on even in the face of becoming martyrs for the faith. And somehow we think that they possess something we are incapable of possessing. But I want us to go back in this study and to remember that these were ordinary people, very ordinary people, doing ordinary things. They were working. They had occupations and vocations that they did just like we did. They had families. We know that they did because we hear the healing of Peter's mother-in-law, for example. We know that they had sibling relations, that they left their parents to go and do this. So they're very ordinary people who are going about their work in the most ordinary of ways. It will be the same story that we learned of Mary being the ordinary girl from this little tiny town. And it seemed to be the people that Jesus was drawn to was the ordinary, because maybe it wouldn't seem extraordinary what they ended up doing had they been people of rank or privilege. Jesus was teaching that even the least of us, no matter who we are and where we find ourselves, have the capability of being extraordinary workers in his kingdom. And that's all depends upon how you define extraordinary, because to be extraordinary doesn't mean I have to have my name on a building, or I have to be able to leave behind these statues or things that spoke of my significance on earth. In fact, maybe that's not who it is at all. Maybe my purpose here is simply to touch one life, or to change one family's life, or to just work alongside others so that greater works can be done in the kingdom. And so it's a way of teaching us that working individually or in groups, we can go on and do extraordinary things. But sometimes when we forget that they were ordinary people, we wonder sometimes why they acted the way they did, why they made the mistakes that they made and said some of the things that they said. When we, looking from all these years later, will go, well, that wasn't smart to say that, or to take that attitude. But what we need to see within these people is that because they were ordinary, sometimes they didn't get it. Sometimes they didn't get the message that Jesus was trying to give them. And sometimes they got it completely wrong if they didn't just missed it. And in so doing, there were times where Jesus reprimanded them, maybe criticized them to some degree, or he stepped back and realized he needed to teach them in a different way, hence the parable stories. How was it that they were missing the point? And so, no matter how errant they might have got in that, what we find is Jesus still used each of those as a teachable moment. And so during this season of Lent, which we often think of as a season of introspection, where we pause, remember, Lent means slowing, like at the coming of spring. It's a slow process that you don't hurry along. And that's why we take these 40 days to really pause and look introspectively as to how do we empathize with their mistakes and identify with them, because we find ourselves still doing the same thing. Sometimes we're missing the point. Sometimes we want to see the world in a different way than Jesus was portraying it. Sometimes we find it very difficult to follow Jesus, as did they. And so we'll learn from them as we move through this particular series. And so when we look this particular 12, and remember, and I always pause, remember there were many followers of Christ, many. This would be his inner circle, though, what I would call today his small group. This would be the group that he would gather with. He would have conversation. He would have fellowship. He would dine with them. He would walk with them through their troubles. And then there would be even a more intimate circle that we see go up on the Mount of Transfiguration with him. But, when we look at these that he called, we wonder, well, why these 12 men? What was it about them that spoke to him, that said, that's the one that I want to use in that? Well, perhaps it was just their willingness to say, yes, I'll come and follow you. And, and we think, well, what does that say to us? Because, we're never told any about others. And they said, I don't think so. And yet we hear those stories of, let me go back and bury my father. Let me go back and do this. And we also hear in scripture the stories of those after he taught these things. And it said, and many disciples walked away, for to follow him was too difficult. These 12, the first thing they did, the one thing that brought them in, was their ability to say, yes, I see something in Jesus that I want. I see something that he is professing that I think is truth. And I want to come and be a part of that. And so maybe that says something to us today, is maybe Lent is our time to say yes again. Maybe we've gotten off track and we've looked in other directions, and we thought we can make it on our own without our dependency upon God. And Lent is a reminder, no, we said yes to following him. And now we need to come back perhaps and remind ourselves that we said yes, and to say yes again. And we also remember that he did not pick perfect people. He picked people who were going to keep making mistakes. But in those mistakes, were they ready to learn and to grow and to ultimately stay in relationship with Christ? And we'll talk about this at some point later, but it's the two extreme differences between Peter and Judas Iscariot. Peter felt remorse. He wanted to be forgiven. He returned to Jesus to seek that forgiveness. Judas Iscariot, according to one of the Gospels, also found remorse and tried to return the coins,
but he never went to Jesus expressing that remorse. And you'll recall that he went out and took his own life after that. He could not see that Christ would want to have a relationship with him after this. And so when what Peter found in the ascension, the resurrection story of Jesus, when he meets them at the beach and Peter jumps out of the boat and swims toward him, is Jesus was ready to take him back in to forgive his mistakes and to forgive his sinfulness. And that's the difference between a Peter and a Judas Iscariot. And sometimes it's the difference between us. We think what we've done is so unforgivable, the mistakes so grievous that Jesus couldn't possibly want us back. And what we learn if we watch these disciples' story is they made mistakes. They had power plays. They missed the point that Jesus always sought to have a relationship with them. So as we look at their mistakes, maybe we will identify ourselves within their stories and to recognize wherever we've gotten off track, Jesus is still there waiting for us and expecting us to come back. So sometimes we talk, well, what's the difference between a mistake and a sin? Well, a mistake is some things we do because we've had poor judgment. Maybe we didn't have all the knowledge that we needed to do that, or we just didn't think about the consequences that were going to happen when we did that thing. Like, oh my goodness, we forgot to put on our seatbelt when we were in the car. We had a wreck and we were grievously hurt. That was a mistake. It wasn't a sin. It was a mistake. A sin, though, in contrast to a mistake, is things, ideas, or experiences that move us from a transformative relationship with Christ. In other words, there is a huge barrier or separation between us and Christ because of some unfolding event. Then it becomes that sinfulness. And so here again, I come back to Peter and Judas Iscariot story. They both betrayed Jesus. They both did in their own way. Peter by word and action and denial, Judas by selling him out, if you will. And so both of them had the opportunity to come back. Both of them made errors in judgment. Of what they did. But you can see that for Judas, it became a breach, that he died with that breach still there. And so with Peter, his was not, it was a healed thing. So mistakes turn into sins if we allow them to separate us from who Jesus is, and to recognize that his transformative work can help us so that those same consequences, those same events don't happen to us in the future. And so I hope that clarifies that. So when I'm talking about mistakes the disciples made, I'm not talking that what they did was sinful, or it's just things that temporarily separated them, or lessons they could learn or we can learn by what they did. So to begin our lesson, we want to look at the Gospel of Luke 5, 1 through 11. And in that story, we see what Jesus is asking us to do, in order to, how to live and what is enough. And so that leads us to the question of, well, then what is enough? And we ask ourselves this question all the time, all of us who live now, and we're inundated with commercials and ads and talk of, well, how much is enough? We live in various size homes. We have various size bank accounts. We have various size retirement plans. The question is, well, what is enough? Well, if we want the basic answer as to what is enough and living as disciples, look what Jesus told the 12 in the Gospel of Mark. He said he called the 12 and began to send them out two by two and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He ordered them to take nothing for the journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and not to put on two tunics. So basically, he sent them out with a staff, a thing that would, I guess, could maybe be a means if someone tried to attack them, but it's also a means to retrieve things. But don't take anything to eat. Don't take yourself an extra set of clothes, any bags or things that you need, and no money in your belts. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never been on a trip and packed that sparsely. In fact, I tend to go overboard. Take everything that I think I might ever need. My husband and I are both guilty of that same thing. But why such a directive? Why such a definitive lack of stuff is he telling the disciples to go out? It just seems like an odd story to us. And so when we look at that, as we move on, how are they supposed to survive on so little? They had no water. They had nothing to eat. They didn't have a change of clothes. They had some sandals on their feet, one tunic, and this staff. That is all they had. They had no money to buy any provisions. Well, this seems kind of a preposterous idea for us. But remember, it's not always what he says, but what's the meaning behind what he is saying? What can we take out of that meaning for us today? What Jesus was instructing them to do was to accept hospitality. He wanted the disciples to travel lightly, not only to facilitate their ease in moving from place to place, but to instill within them the need for community and the dependence upon God. It is somehow true in our culture that the more we depend upon the stuff we have, the less we depend upon what God wants to provide us. We begin to think that we have acquired all this and that we're self-made, that we can operate without needing anybody else. And right out of the chute, the first message the disciples are supposed to receive is depend upon me. Depend upon the other people gathered around you. Now, he really wasn't teaching. Now, it's preposterous to think, well, if everybody followed this advice today, nobody had anything, then we'd all become beggars and starve to death in the midst of it. So we're kind of missing the point of that. And that wasn't at all what he was saying. But what he was saying, that we have to depend upon our community that we live in, because we will not all possess the same gifts and talents, and we'll need to interlock with one another. We'll need to depend upon one another. And we know we're not an island that is meant to live outside. Also, we are to avoid requiring so much stuff that it burdens us so that we cannot move, we cannot be hospitable. But more importantly, like I said, that it makes us think that we're depending totally upon ourselves instead of upon God or something else. And so one of our things, and we pause during Lent to think about, is if I become dependent upon my community and God, or am I dependent upon something or someone else? Whereas those first two things are not the things I turn to and need and depend upon. Instead, I depend upon myself. I depend upon everything that I've stored up or everything that I possess. Or maybe I put my faith in the stock market, or maybe I put my faith in my bank or my broker who advises me how to do stuff, or upon someone else that is not walking in that discipleship path. Because when we begin to do that, what we're seeing is we're beginning to separate and we're creating a barrier. And I've told you what that barrier's name is when we do that. So for Jesus, he was trying to teach the importance of being in community. And what he was teaching the disciples is, we'll read this phrase, extending hospitality has the benefit of participating in Jesus' ministry by caring for and being with the disciples. Jesus knew that when the disciples showed up on their doorstep and they had a story to tell, that the people needed to be able to care for them. They needed to be able to give. And just as importantly, the disciples needed to be able to receive in parts of that, which brings us to this question of which is easier, caring for or being cared for? Well, now I've asked this question in numerous times in numerous studies. And by and large, the one thing I always get is people would much rather be caring for someone than being cared for. Because when we're being cared for, it makes us think, now I'm being dependent upon them. And I don't like to be dependent. That means that I'm not in control of something. It is the number one complaint that I hear from people when I go see them in assisted living or nursing home is, I don't like being dependent upon people. I hear it from the people aging. And so I'm going to do a timeout here and remind each of us, we're all dependent on somebody. We came into the world dependent upon somebody. We came into the world dependent upon parents who were going to meet our basic needs. We come in needing a companion, a partner in life, somebody to walk through this. We depend upon our friends to be there in certain situations and other relatives and acquaintances. We depend upon our church to provide us spiritual needs. our doctors to give us good medical advice, our financial people to give us good financial advice. You see, so this idea that we don't depend upon anybody but ourselves, it is not possible. I depend upon the grocer to stock the shelves so that when I go in and decide I want to buy something, it's there. I depend upon everyone at the bank to do their job. So when I swap my ATM card to pay for it, then the money is going to be there. So this fallacy that we don't have to depend upon anybody is key to this message to the disciples. And when he put this group together, what he was saying, and what we still stay in small groups, is that you need one another to walk through life with. Sometimes you're going to have a deep blow in life and you need this community to surround you. They need to bring you food. They need to care for you. And that's going to flip because somebody else in the group will then need it at some other point of time. And so worship of God cannot be done without community being there too, because in the worship is when we do intercession and we show God our care for other people. So, it's got to be the two beams of the cross, not just the one. And so, yeah, sometimes it is easier to care for somebody than being cared for. But I'm telling you, we give a gift to people when they can care for us. And and I think the pleasure I get sometimes in going and doing and giving for others, I need to give that pleasure to somebody else when I'm in a difficult time, in a grief period of time. I need to be able to go, yes, I need your care of me. Yes, I need to accept that, however it is that you want to offer that to me. It's the great laboratory where we learn from. I've often told people that it's one of the things that maybe as we all get older, we can look into and think, when I am the one that is in that nursing home or assisted living and I'm being cared for by someone else, that in their caring for me and me allowing that, they're deepening their skills in compassion and empathy. And that is a good thing for them because then they're becoming more Christ-like because of what they're able to do for me. So that means I've got to surrender. And that's a hard thing for us to do. And it's no easier for me than anybody else to walk into that time of surrender. But, I really do have to step back and let people feel their Christ-given responsibility to care for other people. So I think we have to practice that. Well, we leave that idea and we can kind of summarize it with this. Being cared for, the disciples learned humility, that they weren't in this alone. They learned to trust that God had gone before them and provided for them. And then they had a sense of gratitude they would not have had if they'd just done everything for themselves. And ultimately, the reality that they were learning is to be dependent upon one another. Now, if we want to take an analogy, every sports team often has these kind of moments together. If you're a basketball fan, you know that preseason, when it's not a time of COVID, oftentimes coaches will take their teams to play in other places, to play in tournaments that really have nothing to do with rankings, or to go overseas and do some play there. And developing their skill set is one thing. But what a coach always wants his people to learn to do is to depend upon one another. They need to work together, realizing, like I said, they're all got skills, they've all got talents, they all have gifts, but they all don't have the same ones. And, no more could one player go and play another team by themselves and think that they were going to come out to win. You learn that the more you gather in community, the more you can support one another, then the better it's going to be for all people concerned in that. So being a receiver of these gifts allows others the opportunity to minister. And that's what the disciples were learning. They were going to minister to people, but they also needed to learn, what did it feel like to be ministered to, so that they could begin to see both sides of the coin. And I'll just end it with one final analogy. In some medical schools, they make the doctors, the students who are to become doctors, go through all the medical tests or some of the medical tests that a patient might experience. Everything from a colonoscopy to an EKG, because they want them to know this is what it feels to be on this side of the bed. What does it feel to be the one laying there in the unknown, the unexpected, in the dark, because you don't have this knowledge? And so that's what Jesus is teaching the people. When you're coming in, and you're totally dependent upon me, get what that feels like, because that's what these people need to feel in order to be able to become followers of me. Well, as we go on to this act of hospitality that Jesus was teaching these people, we come into a story that we find in the Gospel of Matthew. And we're just going to look at that together today. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. Now, to set this in context, Jesus has just learned that John the Baptist has been beheaded in prison. And so, having heard what happened, he's in despair. He's sad. His relative has now been killed, and so he's moving away. But yet the people still want to be with him. They still want to listen to him. They still think that he's somebody. He's beginning to attract a large crowd of followers. And so it says, when he landed, he saw this large crowd. He had compassion on them and he healed their sick. Even in the midst of his hurting, he could see their compassion and he wanted to heal them. But as evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." And Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." "Well, we have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here to me," he said, and he directed the people to sit on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. And they all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate, about 5,000 men, besides women and children. What's an astounding story, is it? And we're not going to get into, well, how is that even possible? Remember, Jesus was in the miracle business, right? But the point of the story is, remember, this is early in Jesus' ministry, and he's teaching. He's teaching his followers, but he's mainly teaching these 12 that are following around him. He needs them to learn again, where is your dependency, within this. So all 4 Gospels contain this particular story of the feeding of the 5,000. And there would be 2 other stories in the Gospel of Matthew and in Mark, which tells the story of a second feeding of 4,000 people. So the fact that in all we hear this story and one more in the Gospels is very significant to us. And that makes it very significant among the stories that Jesus told. So what was the point of these stories? What was the, whole expectation? And like I said, let's just take it all at face value without the understanding of how is this possible. Let's just move beyond there. But we remember as we move into this story that Jesus had been teaching and healing all day. He'd gone to a solitary place. People had followed him. He felt compassion upon them. He began to heal. He began to teach, and the hour's drawing late. And the disciples remind him, this place is deserted. Remember, he's gone to a solitary place. He's away from town where other people are. And it's getting late, and these people are going to start getting hungry, which is probably their way of saying, we're getting hungry. We want them to go home so that we can eat, and it's improper to eat in front of them. They wanted to call it a day, if you will, like we're tired and we want to go and have some time of refreshment ourselves. And so the response by Jesus has to surprise them when they said, well, this is all we've got, because he said, you give them something to eat. And we're trying to figure out, well, what was his tone in that? Well, you feed them, you feed them. Where was the emphasis inside that story? You give them something to eat, or you give them something to eat. Was it a command, a direction, an expectation? What was his tone in saying that? And of course, their response was, this seems like total being startled. And so they give a reason why that's not possible. Just right off the bat, what would take 200 denarii, which is 200 times their daily wage rate of 1 denarii. And so what was their tone? Well, their tone was, I think, a definite, well, how is that even possible? We don't have enough money to do this. And it's not like there's a McDonald's. We can just go out and order a catered meal to come in here. And so the question that we paused with, though, is, whose food do you think the 5 loaves and 2 fishes belong to? And how do you think they felt about sharing this food as perhaps what it meant to them. Now, this was my food. We brought this to eat amongst ourselves. We didn't bring it to share with these other people, right? They didn't see that, where did the gifts of food they had come from? I worked, I fished for this. My wife baked this bread. I don't know why I would have to share it with somebody else. I did all the work to gain this. How dare you ask me to give part of it away or to feed them what was supposed to be for me? Is it beginning to sound familiar here? Sometimes when we're asked to do something for someone else, we want to justify why that's just a terrible idea that we would go and give for them. They didn't do anything to earn that. Well, the question is, does generosity spawn more generosity? Because we hear this story that he blessed it and gave it out, and at the end, there was some left, which has always caused me to wonder in this story. If you're leaving your home, you're traveling a distance, people knew there was no place to stop in and get a quick bite to eat. Did they throw some stuff in their own bags? And when they saw the disciples freely sharing what they had, then they too felt more willing to freely share. Do stories like that do that to you? I think so. I think that's why telethons work. Telethons, when you see people and you hear the stories of people giving out sometimes of their poverty instead of their generosity, you think, well, I can do that. I can give to that, can't I? And so maybe Jesus is teaching that when you're generous, then generosity spawns more generosity. And the thing that we see immediately when we look at the disciples' response is when they looked at the difficulty of the situation and the solution, well, could you feed them? Their only solution that popped in their head was they had to go to town and buy something, and it was going to cost too much. They never looked at what they already had in hand and how it might be useful. He wasn't asking them to go outside. He just says, look at what you already have. How would that part help somebody else? And they don't seem to pause to pray, to think, okay, if I've got this, what's the best way I can share this so that people might be served in the process of it? And sometimes we get stuck on looking at human-sized solutions or God-sized solutions. So and let's just take this down to the basic things. Our food pantry feeds about 100 people every time it's open, 100 families about every time that it's open. And if someone came to me and said, Glenna, I need you twice a month to feed 200 families, because they only come once a month, so that's 200 different families that come to that. I need you to take care of that. I would have be like them. Why, it would cost, $10,000 for me to be able to do that, or whatever figure that I wanted to throw out there. And Jesus was coming back to this whole idea of community, that if each person takes and gives, then a God-sized solution can happen. And that's what we see in the feeding of the food pantry. We come in with this little bag of food, maybe two, often one, and in it we've put some items that are on the food pantry list. But when hundreds of people come and do that, and they put it together, then the generosity from one has got a generosity from another. And guess what? 200 families are easily fed once a month. And so sometimes we have to look beyond what seems impossible. How does this little bit help anyone? To remembering that this little bit and this little bit all put together create God-sized solutions. So when we look at the mistakes that the disciples made, I want to offer three. The disciples, first, they wanted to send everybody home. Jesus had been teaching, he'd been healing all day. Enough's enough. He's poured out enough of himself. They just need to go home. But do you know what happens around the table when you sit around the table? But let's think of it this way. It's your Thanksgiving dinner at your house, and you've got family and friends in. And you've filled your plate, you've sat down, you've feasted on the meal, you've commented how good it is. And as you sit there and you're kind of letting your food settle, maybe before dessert comes, you begin to talk and you begin to share, you begin to reminisce. There's beauty that happens around the table. There's memories that are created around the table. Well, maybe, just maybe, Jesus didn't want to call it a day yet. And it wasn't up to them to make that known. Jesus was the leader. Jesus was the one who would call it a day. And maybe they didn't pause to ask him, well, what should we do? They basically told him what to do. You need to send the people home. And so they didn't come and ask him what it was to do. Because what was to be gained in people staying, maybe what was to be gained in their staying was they could talk and reflect and about what was it Jesus said. Well, what would that look like? What would that mean to me today in the midst of that? Maybe they would, because they gathered around this sharing of the food and they were talking amongst themselves, what do you think he meant when he said that? Well, man, that's different than what we've always been taught, isn't it? But, if we all got together and did that, maybe the world would be a better place. Maybe what he's telling us he was giving them time to what we call saturate in the message, to think about it, to pick it up, to look at it, to share it with one another. And that's still how our small groups work today. You come, you gather around a meal, you enjoy the meal together, and then you begin to talk about your week, and you've each maybe share what's going on and what does that mean and how do we work through these situations. It's just the flow of conversation that God gave us and brings us into community there. And so maybe he knew that if they had this time, they would more fully understand not only his message, but how to work together with one another. Because remember, he said it separated them into groups. And then they shared and they talked. And isn't that small group ministry at its heart? Well, the second mistake that they made was the assumption that what they had was not enough. Now, the only thing that they could come up with was to suggest that they go buy food for everybody else. Well, that was immediately dismissed as extravagant and unreasonable, and there they stopped. Well, our first plan was to go to the store and buy something for everybody, and that's not going to happen. So now we don't have any other ideas. They just wanted to stop, within that. And so they had no vision or creativity to face this challenge that was before them. And so, back to Jesus, idea, well, what do you mean? You give them something to eat. What did he mean? You come up with something, you think about it, maybe they need to eat something that's not physical food, but spiritual food. How are you going to solve this particular problem? And they just thought what he said was the most ridiculous thing ever. And sometimes I wonder, do we as churches kind of do the same thing? And so I think about this, and this was several years ago, well, way before the pandemic hit. But I remember seeing this story. It was about a church in downtown Atlanta. It was on the corner of a very busy road. But one day they decided that they were going to have drive-through prayer at their church. So they put out signs in the yard. And so as people were heading to work, heading to school, heading about their day, they could wheel into the parking lot. There would be somebody there to meet them. How can we pray for you today? They would be prayed for. And then they would go pull back out into traffic and go about their business. Now, I remember thinking at the time, can you imagine the church leadership council meeting where this was suggested? I got an idea. Let's just have people pull in, pray for them, and then they'll be on their way. And there has to be somebody going, well, that's not the way you're supposed to pray. You're not supposed to pray in your car. You're not supposed to meet people outside of their doorway. No one will ever come and do that. And who is it's going to pray? You qualified to lead prayer? I can hear it. I can hear all the dissension that would come from this idea. And yet the people did it anyway. They listened to probably the dissension, they did it, and it was a blazing success in this community. School children would ask for prayers. They were anxious about an upcoming test or something that was going on in school. Parents would offer up something. The busy business executive would talk about being burdened by things, and they told story after story of the impact upon this. There were those who were without work who would stop in. They didn't even have a car to drive in, but they would come in and meet in that safe outdoor space and they would pray together and they would go on. See, sometimes we look at things with human solutions and not God-sized solutions. And if we invite God into that solution, what is the idea that is, going to happen? And, and we remember, we come back to this collection of community and remember, well, in community, what could we do? It's the source of our community garden. I mean, everybody just said, well, if I have a little garden, my little bit of excess isn't going to help anybody. But in our community garden, everybody takes 10% of what they grow themselves plus what the garden grows. And now we give away thousands of pounds of food every year, simply because what every little bit that people have to offer is brought together, and in community, it is given away. And there again, we think, well, is generosity spawning generosity? And I think sometimes we think what we have to do is so little that it's really not significant. And so I'll share just a brief story with you. When I was in seminary, one of my mentoring experiences was to work in Family Promise, which is a place where people who find themselves homeless can come, and they stay in churches in the evening. Every week they move to a different church. And here again, it's pre-COVID. I'm not sure what they're doing now. But during the day, they would go to a center and they would work on job skills, resume, and just trying to give themselves a financial break so they could get back on top of things. And I was working there with a young woman who had a problem. And her problem was that someone had borrowed her car, they had wrecked it. And because of that wreck, she somehow lost her license in the midst of that. And so she was, and if you don't drive in the city of Knoxville, we're not really a bus-friendly town for getting childcare and work and being able to do all that. And so it's a real hindrance if you don't have a driver's license and can't drive. And so when she had the ability to get a car, but getting her license back depended upon her. She didn't have a car at the moment, but to get her license back, she had to have non-driver insurance. Well, I'd never heard of such a thing. I thought, well, that's just something somebody's telling you. And she was stuck. She didn't know how to go. So I just said, well, I'll look into that. And I went and I called an agent. I said, I've never heard of this particular thing. And they said, yeah. And so they told me what it was, what it cost, and what would be necessary for her to do that. So I go back, I give her this information. Well, now she has a plan. She has the money. She knows how to get what she needed. She knows how to go back to court to speak to the judge about getting her license back. Now, I would have called what I did very insignificant. But, it just took that one little thing, me calling a contact I had who was in my church, who was an insurance agent, and asking advice and then taking that back. I didn't pay for her to have to go do that. But, I use that certainly not to elevate myself in any way, but to say sometimes what we do that we think is so insignificant is absolutely huge to somebody else. It gives them the bump they need to move to the next step. And so sometimes it seems pitiful to us what we offer somebody, but yet it can be very important. And so the third lesson, Jesus is calling us to look beyond the immediately obvious. Well, yeah, you've just got this little bit of food, and it would not seem that that little bit is going to do a whole lot. And we could understand their bewilderment. I mean, if we used to have dinners at church, and if 3 times the number of people came, we'd say, how are we going to feed these people? But I think we probably could have figured it out, had more than we thought. But they were bewildered as to how they could make it work. And yet when Jesus said, give me what you have, I will bless it, they did it anyway. Small as it was, they thought, okay, well, I guess it's better that everyone has one teeny tiny bite than to have none at all, right? And so they still did what he asked them anyway, even though to them it was not obvious that Jesus had that power. They were still learning, weren't they? They were still learning, despite being with him, the things that Jesus could do. And for the disciples, that would be their lesson. They just had to keep showing up and doing what Jesus asked them to do. And isn't that this important lesson for us? Do we just stop showing up? We just think it's an impossible task. We think that we cannot, do that anymore. And it just seems, far beyond us. And some years ago, some of you probably participated in this, our annual conference decided that we were going to give $1 million to the No More Malaria campaign as a conference. And then that bishop left and a new bishop came in, our current bishop, Bishop Taylor. And, so she walks in and she inherits this challenge that we're going to raise, this Holston conference, $1 million. And so they hired this person who came in and she was phenomenal, but she worked with every church in the conference to say, what is the one little thing that you think that you could do, no matter how small, how great? So people did creative and wonderful things. And not only did the conference raise $1 million, they surpassed $1 million because they recognized that, well, this is just what we're being told to do. So in some way, how can we contribute? And of course, it was mainly buying malaria nets, which were $10. And so, you got it down to a level where everybody thought, well, and I can remember when the churches I was in they said today, please don't go out for lunch. Take the money you was spent for lunch and donate it to the No More Malaria campaign. I still had food at home. It was easy to miss lunch by going out and donating that money. So they took that down and they took it down to, the little thing. So the disciples were like that. They just kept showing up and doing what Jesus asked. And that's what we're asked to do. Just keep showing up and give whatever you can, however you can, participate however you can. And I'm not always talking about financial gifts, giving of self, because that's at the end of the day what Lent is about. Lent is about personal sacrifice, but intentional giving. It's like, I'm going to give this, but in order that I may give too. And so sometimes we think a lot about how it is that we give things up. But the question we might learn is, how do we give outwardly in the midst of that? What is it that we're giving to? Not taking from. Well, I'm not going to eat this food, or I'm not going to participate in this activity, or I'm not going to. But you don't surrender something and then not give it back in some other way. And so sometimes that means that we're taking on something else. So maybe I'm giving up that hourly show that I watch every night or something like that, and instead giving back to God my time in devotion and prayer. Maybe it's that I'm giving up something that I normally enjoy in order to give to someone else to enjoy it. So this is the Lent part. It's a sacrifice, but it's a giving too, because what we're seeking in all that is not just those acts, but how it's going to transform us so that even when Lent is gone, that's still very much a part of who they are. And so when it comes to the issue of enough, the disciples didn't necessarily want more for themselves. Yet they were guilty of hoarding what they had. And we can be guilty of the same thing. It's like, well, they weren't asking for more food. They just didn't want to share what they had. And the question sometimes we have to ask ourselves is, well, how much stuff do we need to accrue and still think we don't have anything to share with somebody else? I always think of this because we're the only nation in the world that has personal storage units to the magnitude that we have in the United States. There are parts of the world. I remember Anita Hinderlight telling a story. She worked with the girls of South Africa. She was reading them a story, and in it was telling about someone putting something in a closet. And the little girls asked her what was a closet. There's parts of the world that they would not know what a closet was. You put your clothes on a peg, and that's all the clothes that you have. There is no storage. There is no putting things away and saving them, for another time or another day. And so, it really calls us to accountability. And that's why I think one of the interesting things we're doing as a mission thing this year is to think about that. What do I need to give up that I'm accruing and donate that to someone else who might use it? So it's a cleaning out and a giving away. It's it's about, remembering that everything that we have was from God, but everything we have is also for God. And so do we hoard, or do we remember that everything that God did not hoard for us, he's poured out generously through his son. And that's what Lent reminds us of. So how do we respond in kind? And so by giving the minimal that they had, look how God multiplied it, and all the people then were fed. What a beautiful lesson for the disciples then and for us today. So as we end this lesson and we continue to pause in the coming week as we talk about Lent, we know maybe we need to assess what is our measuring stick for what is enough. And how does that measuring stick compare to others in the world? What would they consider to be enough? It's a good thing to think about because the US has a very different look at these things than other parts of the world. And how do we, help those particular places? And how is it then that we need to intentionally give out of our abundance and sometimes out of our scarcity? And, as we watched hoarding and the things that were going on during the pandemic, people getting far more stuff than they needed and causing a crisis in our supply chain. When did we get far more than we needed? And thereby we took the abundance and we hoarded it instead of if everyone, took what they needed. It's often a lesson that we use in food distribution. It's not that there's when we talk about hungry people of the world, and it's not that there's not enough food. We don't have a food scarcity problem. We have a food distribution problem. We have places of the world that have far more than they need, and that doesn't help the places in the world that don't have enough. So these are things that we might consider during Lent. And when we focus on that for the week, we might want to think every time we see bread, or we can just say food here. But, may it remind us of enough relative to the needs of the hungry world. And maybe that we recognize that the bread of life, Jesus himself, is truly enough for us. Maybe it helps us in that sense of not feeling the need to gather and to accumulate. And if you want to, we've looked at the feeding stories in the Gospel of Matthew, the first one, the 5,000, but look at the second feeding story and how's it the same? How is it different? And look at the tone and instructions from Jesus in this one as compared to the one that we read for today. So I thank you for being with me. I thank you for sharing your time as to take time to look at this, but I particularly hope that as you move into the Lenten season, this gives you some food for thought and maybe some practices through the week. So I invite you to join me again next week as we look at the second lesson that we might learn from the disciples as they were learning as they went along. Maybe we won't make the same mistakes. Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be with you. And I'll just ask that we close with prayer. Oh God, quiet the noise around us and within us, so that we can be attentive to your presence as we journey during this Lenten season. Help us during the coming weeks to claim the discipline we need, but so often lack, to live out the desire of our heart and soul for a meaningful season of sacrifice and preparation. We confess that we live as if we'll never have enough, not enough to satisfy our needs, much less to satisfy our wants. Forgive us for thinking that the emptiness we feel inside can be filled by acquiring more things on the outside. Challenge us to look at what we have and see that it is indeed enough, not only for our needs, but also we have plenty enough to share with others. We acknowledge what we know, but so often forget that only in receiving your grace and love can we be satisfied in the depths of our souls and boldly proclaim it is enough. Amen. Again, thank you for being with me, and I will see you next week.